Hi, everyone. My name is Hallie Caldwell, and I work with Inspira Advantage, and we're excited to have you all join us to talk about building your medical school list today. We have two great panelists with us who will take us through the process and the things that you should be thinking about as you begin to think about where to apply. So today we're going to introduce our panelists. We'll talk about the MSAR, factors to consider building your list, some tips, and then we'll open things up for a Q&A. So as we go through this and you have questions, feel free to pop them into the Q&A question box, and we'll definitely get to those at the end. Chiamaka, can you introduce yourself?
Hi, everyone. Thank you so much for being here today. My name is Chiamaka. I am a rising fourth-year medical student at Geisel School of Medicine at Dartmouth, planning on applying into dermatology, currently doing a research year, and I've been a member of the admissions committee for going 3 years now.
Great. Thank you so much for being here. We've had you at some webinars before, and you're always fantastic to have. Neil, as well as, can you introduce yourself?
Yeah, hey guys, I'm Neil. I went to the University of Michigan for med school, graduated just a year and a half ago. Now a resident in dermatology at New York University. I promise not everyone in medicine is a dermatologist. You can do other things too. And yeah, I was an admissions counselor at the University of Michigan and now help review applications at NYU for dermatology.
Great. Thank you so much for being here. And Neil's joined us as well. And they're both fantastic parts of the Inspira Advantage team. And thank you both for being here. So we'll dive right in and talk a little bit about, there we go, gathering information as you begin your med school process. Chiamaka, you wanna lead us here?
So most people who are applying into med school, I think the first thing is, where do I gather all the information? What's the best medical school for me? Where should I apply? I mean, there are hundreds of medical schools in the United States, and building your list can prove overwhelming. Most people decide to apply to schools that they already know about, but there's a tool that has all the information for you that you may be looking for to help you build your school list. And that tool is called the MSAR. So the MSAR is used by anyone applying into a US medical school. And I believe that when I applied, it was the best source of information for me if you're interested in being competitive during this process. It's a valuable resource for you, and it's also a valuable resource for your advisors. So while you're creating your list using this tool, I would encourage you to also send this information to your advisors. So what does the MSAR have? When you log into the MSAR, there are two forms of information you're going to get. There's a free part of this database. So in case money is a problem, this is still a tool you can use. But then there's a paid version that expands the free version. So when you click on it in alphabetical order, every single US medical school is listed on that database. They start with Albany Medical College, and you're going to see, they tell you where it's located, which is big. Location is really big for people in case you have families, close ties to a particular place. It tells you if it's a private or public institution. And that also relates to the information they tell you on tuition. So you'll find that some public schools, in medicine, I found that the tuition doesn't really correlate with if it's a public or a private school, but MSAR gives you all that information. And MSAR tells you if it's an urban, suburban, or rural campus. And you're going to find that some medical schools have multiple campuses. MSAR lets you know. In case when you're applying, you want to go to a rural campus, you would know that, okay, I'm applying to Albany Medical College, but I'm trying to go to the rural campus. I'm using Albany Medical College as an example. They also tell you their application deadline, which I believe is so valuable in case you're already passed the deadline. You can choose to apply to other schools or whatever your timeline is. Another important piece is, so a backstory on myself, I'm a non-US citizen, so I'm not American. And the MSAR was invaluable for me when I was applying, because they also tell you, one, if they only accept in-state candidates, if they accept out-of-state candidates, and if they accept what they call international candidates, so candidates who do not have a green card or a US citizenship. And they also, in the paid version, they break down the out-of-state, in-state, and international student category to let you know how many percent. Because some states, some schools will tell you that they accept international students, but then you look and historically, they've never accepted an international student. So when you're looking to stretch your budget, it's very important you're looking at this minute details. They also let you know if they have combined degrees. So for example, at Dartmouth, they give opportunities for us to get MD MPH and MD PhD and MD MBA. Some schools also have a combined bachelor's med degree, and some schools have a combined MD JD. So if that's something you're looking for in your future, that's a good place for you to go to. And then they tell you the class size, which I thought was really big for me when I was deciding. The class size might not help you with when you're creating your school list, but when you ultimately are deciding where you're going to end up going, I actually factored in the class size. So MSAR gives you all that information. And then it gives you information on the tuition and fees. In-state tuition is always cheaper than out-of-state tuition, but you're going to find that private institutions, in-state and out-of-state tuition are equally the same. So they give you that information. A huge thing, which we're going to talk about later, is they tell you what the median MCAT for these schools are and the median GPA for these schools are. You can filter out based on if you put the GPA, you would like to see schools that your median GPA is less than a 3.7, they would spit out that list for you. But we're going to talk more about how you should use your GPA and your MCAT when you're creating your school list. So yeah, the MSAR, I know 1 year subscription is about $28. A 2-year subscription is about $36. So it's not breaking the bank, but in case there are free information, the paid one is just an expansion on that free information.
Fantastic. Thanks so much for going through that. So now we're going to talk about considerations that you should take into account while building your list. These are...
Oh, go ahead. Sorry.
Oh, these are some of the things that we're going to touch on in the following slides. We don't need to go into detail here, but just an overview. And then we'll dive into location.
Yeah. So as you guys, may be experiencing right now or know, applying to med school is stressful. It's a challenging process. It's becoming ever more competitive, even from when I was applying like 5-6 years ago. So there are a lot of factors to consider, as we demonstrated on the previous slide. One of those factors might be location, right? So, people might have family ties to a certain area. You may have climate preferences. You may just like being in a city versus a more rural setting. You may like having space, not having space. I'm in New York right now and I'm the latter. The cost of tuition might matter to you quite a bit as well. I mean, it's quite a significant financial investment. If you, for example, live in a state and decide to go to a state medical school, your tuition decrease as compared to a private institution or out of state might save you hundreds of thousands of dollars over 4 years or 5 years, however long you stay. So, that's just one factor to consider.
And I would expand on that. Cost of living, I think it's a huge one, because most times you're taking out loans, and if you're taking out loans cost of living adds to those loans. So if you're living in rural New Hampshire compared to New York City, you might end up having a significant difference in how much loans you might need to live in both places. But I would say even more than cost of living, your support system. Med school is tough, like Neil said, and 4 years is a long time, and 4 years is a good amount of time for you to build your life. I know most pre-meds who are thinking about med school are looking at med school in that tunnel vision. I want to get into med school. That is the ultimate goal. But you also have a life outside of med school. So make sure you're looking at what location will serve me for my mental health and my support system when going through your school list.
All right. Move on here to tuition and costs. We touched on this a little bit earlier, but we can dive in a little bit more here.
I can take tuition and cost. So I would say when I was building my med school list, tuition and cost wasn't something I factored in. And obviously, the amount of loans you take out should ultimately matter in your decision to go to a medical school. In fact, I think when I'm ranking things that matter, tuition and cost is way up there for me. But in the initial phase, when you're building your school list, I think I found that if I considered the tuition that was listed on MSAR, I would have missed out on a few opportunities, because you never know what financial aid package you're going to get till they give you an acceptance. And when they give you an acceptance, the financial aid office reaches out to you and tells you how much in scholarships they can give you, how much in loans you can get, what type of loans they can give you, if it will be private, public, all of those information. So know that, yes, it's something you should consider, but it should not deter you from applying to a school that you ultimately want to go to.
That's a great point. Neil, do you have anything to add there?
No, I don't. I think that's exactly right.
So we'll touch a little bit on just the program type that you might want to apply to. Neil, do you want to take this?
Yeah, absolutely. So, one major distinction you're going to see is MD allopathic schools versus DO schools, osteopathic schools. There's a big, hubbub about this, and it's sort of an elephant in the room that, like, there's a stigma against DOs in the US, and that's unfortunate, to be completely honest. My intern year, I was in a program, an internal medicine program that took a lot of DO students who worked alongside me, were incredible physicians, got into great fellowships. But it is an unfortunate reality that, it is harder for students who went through DO programs to get into specialties like dermatology, like orthopedic surgery, like neurosurgery, that are considered the more competitive specialties. So, I think one factor to consider is that it might be easier to get into a DO school based on statistics, and you may have an interest in osteopathic medicine, treating the whole patient, approaching care more holistically, but it may factor into the types of specialties or the type of medicine you can practice later on in your life. So it is a difficult decision. We can definitely chat more about it if you guys have questions about that distinction. But for right now, I'll just kind of leave it at that.
Yeah. And I'll say we also ran a webinar about a week ago on MD versus DO and kind of the distinctions and how to choose. And that's up on the Inspira Advantage website. So if you want to go check that out as well, that's available.
And I'm going to add, not all DO schools are created equal. There are some DO schools that have been institutions for a long time, and they have an established curriculum, an established alumni network, established hospital networks. So when you're creating your list, DO schools, if your stats aligns with a DO program, don't discount applying to a DO school, but keep that in the back of your mind that not all DO schools are created equal.
Great. Now we'll go and talk a little bit. about residency match rates.
I'm happy to take this one.
Yes, since you're the one who's gone through
Residency.
the process.
So yeah, this is a factor that I didn't consider until later in my med school interviewing process when schools actually started talking about it. I didn't really know anything about this, but every school does keep a track and a record of their residency match rates, basically how many of their students match into residencies versus the average nationally, for example. The only reason I guess I would think this is important is if you already know ahead of time that you're interested in a very competitive specialty. Because in general, those competitive specialties have lower match rates. That's kind of why they get the name competitive. So you might want to go to a school that has experience with placing students into those more competitive specialties. And, you know, just take that factor into consideration when you're applying to med schools. Personally, I would be surprised if most of you knew exactly what you wanted to do before you enter med school. I think med school is a time for exploration. So this is not the most important factor, but it's something to keep on your radar and to know about when you're looking at med schools.
Great. Amaka, do you have anything to add here?
I think the one thing also, so I haven't gone through the match process, but when I'm looking at schools and their residency match rates, I think you can get a sense if a school leans towards primary care specialties or more subspecialties. So if you care about being a rural physician in primary care, you should look at the match list and know what school would train you to be that type of physician. And if, like Neil said, if you're trying to go into a competitive subspecialty, you should look at what school will ultimately set you up for matching these competitive specialties. I think that's mostly what the residency match rate gives you, because at the end of the day, where you match ultimately relies on how much work you put in, how you were as a student, all those other factors. But for example, dermatology, there are certain schools that do not have home programs. That makes it harder for you to match, and that might be reflected in your match list. So when you're looking at that, consider both sides.
All right, let's talk a little bit just about mission and values.
So I would talk about mission and values. The mission and vision part, I believe, is it falls back to what we said about the residency match list. There are certain institutions that, yes, if they're trying to create physicians and that's what they're trying to do in medical school, every medical school has the mission and vision to make competent physicians, regardless of what specialty you practice in, regardless of how you end up practicing. If you're an MD/MB and you end up being a consult, regardless of that, they're hoping to make competent physicians. But where I believe the mission and vision starts to get broken down is a school more academic? Is a school more more curated to community service? Is a school more mission oriented, where they really have this, they really get into the community, they do more global studies, all of those things? I believe that's where you start to tease about the mission and vision, because overarching, every school has a mission and vision to make you a competent physician, but now you have to look at your goals and see if they align with the school's sometimes silent mission and vision. Mm-hmm.
Neil, do you have anything to add here?
Yeah, I totally agree. I think, you know, sort of in the same vein as Amaka was talking about, the mission and vision really applies to like what you're interested in outside of the core. I want to be a physician, I want to be a doctor. You know, I think if a school, for example, is very interested in research and academic medicine, they'll probably include that in some way in their mission statement. If a school is interested in innovation, technology, producing leaders, innovative leaders, et cetera, they'll kind of weave that into their mission statement. It will depend, on sort of what you're interested in, but I think it's worth looking at because they craft those mission statements very purposefully, because they know it's kind of front and center as the face of their school.
Would either of you say that knowing the mission and vision of a school is really important as you do begin that application process and start writing your personal statements and secondary essays? Like, how heavily is that factored in to the fit portion of application reviews?
Yeah, definitely. So I would start by saying, one, if you kind of incorporate that into your personal statement, et cetera, it kind of shows that you actually read something about the school. So that's number one. And number two, they obviously, like I said, create those purposefully, and they want people who are going to fulfill those missions and values in their school. So at the end of the day, you kind of want to be the person that fits their mold, and you also want the med school to fit what you're looking for. So I think it does not hurt at all. It probably helps you to include that stuff in your writing.
And I second that. When I sit in the admissions committee, the one thing that keeps coming up is, will this person be a good fit for Geisel? So fit, as much as you want to fit into their institution, they want someone that fits into their institution too. Not that every school is trying to only get a cookie cutter candidate where every single candidate has the same interest, but they know what type of candidates have excelled in your school, and your mission and vision can give you an idea of what they might be looking for.
Great. Let's see, there we go.
Yeah.
Talk a little bit about grading.
Yeah, I have a lot of thoughts about this.
Go for it.
I will not go into complete depth about this. I will say there are a couple of different ways that med schools evaluate students. Traditionally, maybe like 15, 20 years ago, there weren't really schools that had pass-fail curriculums. You were graded on every quiz, every test, every rotation, etc. It is moving towards more of a pass-fail setup where they want you to demonstrate competence, but not necessarily fight for every percentage point on tests or quizzes, even on step one now, as of this year, I believe. So pros and cons. I think the pros of having a pass-fail system are that you are much more relaxed in medical school. I'm not saying one is better than the other per se, but I did very much enjoy having a pass-fail curriculum my first year of medical school at Michigan. I think there are cons to having a pass-fail curriculum as it comes to grading and when you're thinking about going to residency programs. Again, I'm speaking from a perspective of, applying to more competitive residency programs who need objective ways to evaluate you. When you don't have grades, you start to rely on more nebulous evaluation metrics like letters, like contacts, like who you did research with, etc. So it's important to keep in mind that if you're going to a school that is completely pass-fail, for example, you're probably also going to be want to be making those connections early on if you're shooting for something more competitive. And again, the downside of having grades is that you're going to be stressing a lot about grades, to put it pretty plainly. That's what I'll say about it right now. I'll let Amaka join in if she has other comments.
Yeah, I very much enjoyed my pass-fail curriculum, and I was pass-fail for my preclinical years and for my clinical years too. And I think it did a lot for my mental health. Just in comparison to my colleagues who I knew were in institutions that were more tiered. But like Neil said, there are pros and cons to everything. I think that one of the cons to a pass-fail curriculum is because it's pass-fail, there is no way to stratify students but there are always ways to stratify students. Every program director, when you're looking for candidates to match to their residency, they need to have a metric on what type of students they want. And if you have a pass-fail curriculum, they can't really gauge how you are academically. But because of that pass-fail curriculum, their expectation becomes that you weren't stressing so much about your grades because you showed that you were competent. But now, what else did you do with all the freedom the pass-fail curriculum gave you? So pass-fail is great, but if you're pass-fail and you want to end up in a competitive specialty, like Neil said, you start having the expectations to start to fine-tune your extracurriculars a little bit more. But guess what? Most times those extracurriculars are things you really care about. They're reasons you came to medical school. Some of them are the reasons you might stick through the 4 years of medical school. So I would say, yes, it can be a con, but it can also be a pro. A tiered system, if you're academically strong and you want to show that off, a tiered system works too. And both ways, you're going to end up in a great program if you end up putting the work. The pass-fail just gives you a little more leeway. And I would say a pass-fail curriculum also adds camaraderie. Because if you're not worried that, well, do I want to give you study tips if I need to be ranked above you? But when it's pass-fail and everyone gets a pass, you're more likely to share resources and information. And you find that no one's ultimately being what you're going to hear med school and pre-med, everyone saying gunner, this person's a gunner. You always have people that just have that competitive spirit in them, but there won't be a systemic reason for it.
I want to add one more thing on this too, which is I think you just need to know yourself as well. I think at the end of the day, no matter what specialty you go into, med school is not just about getting into a residency program. It's about being a competent doctor, like we've mentioned a few times. And that's the purpose of med school, is learning enough medicine to become a competent doctor. So I think you need to know how you're motivated, how you study. So for example, if you feel like you're more externally motivated, if you feel like grades are something that push you to learn, maybe a graded program is better for you. If you're someone who feels like they're internally motivated, like you're really going to do all the studying you need to do to become a good doctor and to feel like you're maximizing your potential without grades, I would say you don't need to go to a program with grades. I mean, I think you're the type of person that's going to do what they need to do to get where they need to go, regardless. So I think it's important to know yourself from that perspective too.
Those are all fantastic points. Thanks for diving so deeply into this. All right, that also provides a good segue to extracurriculars and clinical opportunities. Amaka, you want to take this one?
So the extracurriculars and clinical opportunities, I found that this is usually not something you can really find on most medical schools' websites. Yes, if they are really good at updating your websites to showcase some of the things happening, you can eventually find out. But I find that when I was looking at most medical schools, some of the things I know right now that we do here at Geisel, I would never find on our website, and I wouldn't have used that to ultimately have chosen Geisel. So extracurriculars should be something you should be looking at, and clinical opportunities. Like I said, if you're interested, for example, in a certain specialty, and you find that that school doesn't offer that specialty because they just don't have that program, that's something you should ultimately consider when you are choosing your medical school. If you find that you want to work with, for example, refugees, or you want to do more community-based services, if you find that these opportunities are being offered in a certain med school, I really think that's a good enough reason to pursue that school. But these extracurriculars and clinical opportunities, most schools have a secondary essay where they ask you, why do you want to apply to my school? That's a good place for you to showcase that you've done your research on what extracurriculars and clinical opportunities they offer and which one actually calls to you. I would say like that's a perfect secondary like essay answer prompt for that. I really like your school because you have something called Project Salute, where you work with immigrants. I'm a first generation immigrant. This is the reason I'm just giving an example of how you can use the information you find on these extracurriculars, not only to your advantage, putting it in the essay, but also ultimately helping you choose what med school you want to end up in.
Neil, anything to add here?
No, I think that's perfect.
So you mentioned that a lot of extracurriculars aren't necessarily updated on schools' websites. Do you have either of you have any insider tips on how to go about searching for those? Do you have to contact students? Are you looking at Instagrams? What's the best way?
Yeah, I was gonna actually just gonna mention this in the next slide with culture and fit. But I think the best way to learn about a school is to talk to students. We have great perspectives after being there for so long, and I think that we're generally pretty honest. I mean, nobody's trying to really like sell you their school. By the time you get here, most of us on the admissions committee won't even be here. We're just here to help you. So I think if you reach out to us, most of us are more than happy to help and tell you everything you want to know about the school. Which goes into culture and fit. So I'll let Amaka chime in on that last point before I dive into this.
I've had students reach out to me on Twitter, Instagram. I don't know where they find me. But I think if you're interested in knowing about a school and you know no one in that school, it's fair to reach out to someone who is advertising themselves on social media to be open to mentorship and speaking to potential candidates. A lot of people will be honest with you about your schools, and if they're open to talking to you about your school, I think that's a positive, that they're happy with whatever they've gotten from your institution, enough that they're willing to sell that institution to candidates. So feel free to reach out to people. If you don't hear back from them, people are busy. Don't take it personally. Don't let it count against the school. Just know that, okay, maybe I might have to reach out to someone else.
Yeah, so I think talking to students is also the best way to learn about the culture of a school and how well you'll fit in. And I think talking to more students is the key to that. If you're really interested in a school, really try to talk to as many students as possible. You don't want to cherry pick one or two students and judge the culture of a whole school based on that necessarily. But you can get a pretty good idea if you talk to like 3, 4, 5 students, I would think. And they can kind of give you a vibe for what the school is like and whether you would fit in there. And I think we talked about a lot of this other stuff as well earlier, so I don't think we need to go too much into depth there.
All right, so building your list, achieving list balance. This is something that goes back to college admissions as well. But let's talk a little bit about dream, target, fit schools, and kind of how those should fall in your list.
Yeah, I can start with this one. So I feel like I've done this 3 times now. Undergrad, med school, residency, it just never ends. But there's always this distinction that people make, right? So your dream schools are sort of the schools that you feel like you'd be ecstatic to get into. This is like, yeah, I may not have the stats for this. I may not be their top applicant, but you know, maybe they'll take me. This is my, you know, reach shot. Target schools are the ones where you've done your research, you looked at MSAR and you feel like, yeah, this kind of fits exactly what my application looks like. I think I'd be within the ballpark of what they're looking for academically, statistically, etc. I feel like I have like a 70-80% chance of getting into these schools. Safety schools are supposed to be the schools that like I fell through the cracks at all these other schools. I didn't expect to fall through the cracks, but at least I have a few backups that I'm pretty sure I have like a 90% chance of getting in at. And yeah, we can talk about, you know, balancing exactly. I think we have maybe a slide on that, but balancing, you know, how many of each you should apply to. Amaka and I were chatting about this before the webinar started. You know, like there are a lot of considerations, right? It's a financial investment to apply to so many schools, but at the same time, my personal opinion is you're going to be making a very large investment into medical school in the next 4 years. The opportunity cost for those of you who have taken some economics of losing a year of medical school by not getting accepted into a medical school is quite high. So in my opinion, I think applying to more schools, if you can afford it, is a totally reasonable idea. And I would probably heavily favor towards the target fit schools if I had to put a limited budget on, applying to more schools. Amaka might have different thoughts on that.
I agree with you, Neil. Like Neil said, the amount of schools you apply to, I think, depends on the strength of your application. This is a generalized webinar. We can't really give specific advice to each individual student, but this is where knowing yourself comes into play. What's your MCAT? What's your GPA? How confident are you in your application? When I was applying, I think the general consensus is apply to 25 to 40 schools. I've seen some people apply to 10 and they get in. Some people apply to 50 or 60 and they don't get in. So there's no magical number, but there's a risk for applying to too few, the opportunity cost of losing a year, too many. And everyone is like, oh, why can't I just slap 70 schools on my list? You can, but the secondaries are going to overwhelm you. I wish when you start getting those secondary applications and they come at once, and there's that professional courtesy of getting them back to the schools in that 2-week-ish deadline, and you're having all the schools coming at once, it can be overwhelming. So knowing your application and the strength of your application to decide how many schools to apply to is always great. And yes, I've seen people stratify this dream school, this target school, and the safety school. I think that's the best, the good way to do it. There's no harm to dream. I mean, dreaming is always great. You never know. You just never know who is going to just be drawn to your application. And then boom, you're in a school you just could not even imagine they would even be giving you an interview, and here you are with that interview. So you never know. But if money is a limitation, I would mostly target my resources to safety and target schools, and obviously sprinkle in a few dream schools, but you don't want them dream heavy, but you also don't want them heavy in schools. For example, if you know you're already competitive for MD schools, you don't want to go ahead and apply to 50 DO schools and spend money on that. And for the fee, I know that it's about $170 for the first primary and then $45 afterwards. And then most secondaries are anywhere between $75 to $150. So when you're applying to 25, 50 schools, regardless of how much money you may have or your family has, it's still an investment, and you want to be strategic and not just squander money and your time. But this is where Inspira comes in. If you're interested in building a school list, the coaches here help you build a school list, and they would individualize that based on what your candidacy looks like.
Thank you both. That was a lot of things to think about in one slide. All right, so we covered this in that last slide, how many schools you apply to. Our numbers here are a little bit smaller than what Amaka said, but it sounds like it very much depends on the individual and the person and what types of schools you're applying to. So we don't need to spend too much time on this unless either of you have anything else to add here. All right. So just a couple tips. This will be quick, and then we'll go into some Q&A. So feel free to start adding questions, and we will get started answering those in just a second. So a lot of this is, we don't need to spend time on it, but what we've talked about here, just make sure you do your research. The MSAR is your friend. Take advantage of it. It has a lot of information. And we didn't say this. I'll have both of you talk a little bit about starting early and the importance of that before we dive into questions.
Yeah, I a general principle of my life is that starting earlier in things is more helpful. I can't follow that all the time, but I do advocate for it. I think one thing too that starting early might help you with is sort of building some connections. If you know anyone who's gone through the med school process, reach out to them too. They'll have advice for you, they'll have some insight for you, and they might even keep referring you to other people to talk to. And the more people you talk to, the better your application is going to be. In the long run, you'll get advice, tips, more people to read your essays, fine tune things before you finally hit that submit button. So I think, starting early is a good idea for a number of reasons, those being a few of them.
Amaka, anything else to add here?
Nothing to add.
All right. So we'll dive into some Q&As now. And while we let some questions come in, Neil, Amaka, do you have anything that you would do differently now that you've kind of been through the med school application process? Neil, you've done the residency application. Anything about building a list that you would have done differently or would recommend to your the students that you're working with?
I can add something. When I was applying to med school, I did not think I was going to end up at Dartmouth. I don't remember how Dartmouth got on my list, to be honest with you. This was my very last interview. And I ended up choosing Dartmouth because, like I said, you don't know what financial aid you're going to receive till you receive it. And I ended up preferring the package that I received from Dartmouth. I wasn't going to go to the interview or even apply. So when you're making your list, make sure you're not whatever preconceived notions you have on certain locations, certain schools, certain places. All of those things do not hamper where you apply to. Like, really look at the MSAR, and before you even look at the MSAR, ask yourself what's important to you. If you have a significant other that lives in New York, that location might end up being at the top of your list. If you really just like the idea of taking out $300,000 in loans is just something that you can mentally get past, then the cost of tuition and the cost of living should absolutely be at the top of your list. If you want to be the academic physician person who made this Nobel Prize thing, then a reliance on if they care about academia, they create innovators, what their alumni network looks like, or if you absolutely are like, I want to go to Alaska and work with the native population and be this kick like the person, the go-to physician in this rural place, you look at that too, and any part of those things are very valid. Don't choose things based on what you think the reputation is, where you think you're going to be, like your happiness, your fulfillment, your ultimate goal matters when you're creating your list. So please don't let external things sway you. Like, look within yourself before you start making your list, and make a list of things that matter to you. And I think that would drive your list.
That's some great advice. Neil, do you have anything to add there?
Yeah, I mean, I had a similar story for residency. I was just say, don't be afraid to be surprised by this. Like, don't have preconceived notions, because I was, there was a conflict between two interviews, my NYU interview and another interview. I almost canceled the NYU interview because I didn't know anything about NYU really until I interviewed there. Luckily, the other program accommodated me and I got to interview at both places. I ended up choosing NYU as a place I wanted to be. And my biggest regret actually in medical school applications was not applying to more of the dream schools, because I kind of undersold myself. I thought, there's no way, why would they pick me, et cetera, et cetera. I definitely did not do that for residency, and I think it paid off for me. You never know what people are going to like in your applications. I mean, when I was on my interviews, people would pick out the smallest details from my, short descriptions of extracurricular activities to something that stood out to them. And that's why they picked me for an interview. And that's like, nothing you could possibly expect. So I would say, don't be afraid, just like Amaka said, to dream big for med schools. Again, I know it's a financial investment, so be smart about it. Don't apply only to dream schools, but apply to a few and kind of spread yourself out.
Great. So we have two amazing med students here. So if you have any questions, it doesn't necessarily need to be on building a school list. Feel free to pop them in. They're here and excited to give out information. I had another question. I guess when looking at schools, how important do you think knowing what opportunity, like special opportunities that school offers that might be different than other schools are? Is that something that you should definitely be factoring in, depending on kind of what you want to go into, or are kind of all schools made equally there?
I don't think they're made equally. I mean, I definitely think that schools do have various opportunities based on maybe what their mission is, who their chair is, who's kind of guiding the values of that school. I would say it's really hard to figure that stuff out before you apply. If you're really interested in extracurricular stuff, you have very specific goals in mind, I would talk to the students because we kind of learn that stuff on the job. Like when we get there, sometimes that stuff's just really hard to find out before you apply and before you get in.
I think that's really the only way to find out specific differences, why this program is different from this program. Just looking at just the website, it's really hard to get that information without talking to people who've been there and are there. So we'll reiterate that, like reaching out to people in those institutions. Sometimes you might not be able to do that still during your interview, and then you come up with questions for the interviewer. Or sometimes they have like pre-meets before an interview. You can ask questions during those meetings before your actual interview day, or even after your interview day. When you are deciding what school to choose, you can always reach out to the admissions committee and say, is there someone I can speak to if you can't find someone in your own?
That's great. All right, we have a question here. I'm a senior in college currently, and I'm planning to apply next cycle. What steps do you recommend they begin taking now to get ready for the process? It's a great question. Neil, Amaka, do you have either of you want to start?
Yeah. So yeah, senior in college means you probably have, what is it, like 6-8 months or so before applications open. Yeah, I mean, I would definitely, start researching what schools you're interested in. Start thinking about, it is early to start thinking about specialties and stuff like that. Just think about like where you want to be, what kind of life you want to live in a couple of years. It's a 4-year investment. It's a pretty long time. So start thinking about those, soft factors. And it never hurts to start looking into schools and start looking at the MSAR to see where you stand competitively. I assume you either have taken or are getting close to taking your MCAT. You pretty much have a solidified understanding of what your GPA is. So you can start to think about what schools might be appropriate for you to apply to. You can start talking to other people who are in medical school, who have been through the process, just about pitfalls, things that they wish they'd done differently. If you have any extra time, it never hurts to start working or, continue working on some extracurriculars that you've been involved in. If you want to take a leadership role for these last 6 months, that can look pretty good on an application, especially if you can talk about it in depth. And one other thing I would say is it never hurts to start writing your essays early, because once you let those marinate for a while, you start to think about different things you should include. You start to you may even scrap the whole thing after 2 months and start over again, which I did twice. So I think it's totally reasonable to start doing that stuff early.
Amaka, anything to add?
You should definitely reach out to your admissions, to your pre-med committee. Most schools don't, I haven't seen it as a requirement, but I think if you have a pre-med committee in your institution, it's kind of known that you should get a letter from your pre-med committee. And sometimes your pre-med committee can point you towards the direction of what type of candidate they think you are. They might offer you mock interviews. They might offer you personal statement edit. You never know what resources they may have. So earlier, the better. You do not want your pre-med committee to get to know you when you need a letter. You want them to get to know you before. So as you're a senior right now, I'm assuming you already know your pre-med committee, but if you don't, please reach out to them as soon as possible and get on your radar.
I'll add here too that, again, we did a webinar a few weeks ago on kind of thinking about the 2023 application cycle. So that's free on our website. You can go take a look at that. And that goes a little bit more in depth, but covers basically what Amaka and Neil just said as well.
Oh yeah. Also, Amaka mentioned letters. Just do that for all your letter writers. Like have, start reaching out to them early. It always sucks as someone who's written letters to like get a notice 2 weeks in advance to write a letter. And then you kind of want to do a good job. You don't have time to do a good job. To just reach out early and give them plenty of time.
Another start early there.
I'm not, I don't have any share with this company, but Interfolio is something I used as a pre-med student. And this is a service that stores your letters for you. So if you, it's actually great. And I think they're the one service that works with other third sites like the MCAS, and they will send your letter confidentially and directly to your MCAS application without being, without any problems. I used it 3.5 years ago when I applied to med school, and I found that, when you want to give a heads up, but you also, people are so busy, you really don't want to feel like you're at the end and you need these letters today. You gave them a 4-month heads up, 5 months heads up, and they never got in those letters. So I feel like if you're anxious about that, Interfolio is a good way. Now you store all your letters. And if you're not a senior, you're a junior, you're a sophomore, there might be mentors that you work with along the way that you connect with. And if you're not working with them longitudinally, you might want to get a letter from them from whatever project or whatever time frame you worked with them, and you just get those letters and you store them on Interfolio. You pay for a yearly renewal of your subscription, and they store it for as long as you pay. I went back and all my letters from my med school application is still there, which is like fantastic. So that's also a way to get ahead and plan early.
That's great advice. All right, we'll give another minute or so for any more questions, and then we'll wrap up. But I just want to say, Neil and Amaka, thank you both so much for being here. It's always a pleasure to have you both. I'm sure we'll be asking you back again. And this was definitely, I learned something. I'm sure everyone else did as well. All right, if there's no more questions, we'll call it a day. I want to thank everyone for joining us. You'll receive an email in the next few days, probably Monday or Tuesday, that has a recording of this webinar. You'll be able to find it on our website. And feel free to reach out to Inspira Advantage. You can have a free consultation to kind of learn what services we could provide for you. You could work with some amazing counselors like Neil and Amaka, who will help guide you through your med school admissions process. But I hope everyone has a really great afternoon. And thank you all for joining.
Thank you.